They said she stole from the most powerful man in the city, but no one noticed what he saw first. Naomi Carter's fingers trembled as she stood in the center of the grand living room, the polished marble floor beneath her reflecting a dozen pairs of expensive shoes pointed in her direction, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, yet no one seemed to hear anything except the accusation that had just been spoken out loud, clear and cutting like glass. The DeLuca estate was known for its silence, the kind that came from wealth so absolute it didn't need to prove itself. But tonight, that silence had been shattered by a single sentence that now hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. "The watch is gone," the house manager had said, his voice tight with controlled authority, and she was the last one in the room. A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests gathered for the private dinner, their tailored suits and silk dresses rustling softly as they leaned toward one another, whispering conclusions they had already decided were true before Naomi could even open her mouth. She swallowed hard, her dark eyes darting briefly toward the long hallway behind her as if searching for escape. But there was none. There never was. Not in a house like this. Not in a world where people like her were meant to blend into the background, to exist quietly, to never be seen until something went wrong. Naomi had only been working at the DeLuca estate for 11 days. 11 long days of waking before sunrise, polishing surfaces that cost more than anything she had ever owned, memorizing routines, keeping her head down, her voice softer than necessary, her presence almost invisible, because invisibility meant safety. And safety meant she could keep the job, and keeping the job meant she could send money back to her mother in Atlanta, could keep her younger brother in school, could keep everything from falling apart again. "I didn't take anything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried just enough to draw a few skeptical glances, the kind that didn't need words to say what they were thinking. The missing item wasn't just any watch. It was a custom piece, a limited edition timepiece worth more than most people's annual income, a symbol of status, of power, of control, and it belonged to Vincent DeLuca, a man whose name alone was enough to quiet entire rooms, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. "Of course you'd say that." A woman's voice cut in smoothly, almost amused, and Naomi felt her stomach tighten as she turned toward Isabella Moretti, Vincent's fiancée, standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine in hand, her posture flawless, her expression composed, her eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't kindness either. "But the facts are simple," Isabella continued, taking a slow sip before lowering the glass. "You were cleaning his study, and now the watch is missing. It doesn't take much to connect the dots." A few guests nodded subtly. Others avoided looking directly at Naomi, as if acknowledging her would make them part of the situation, as if she were already something unpleasant they didn't want to touch. Naomi's hands tightened against the fabric of her uniform apron, her knuckles whitening as she fought to keep them from shaking, her mind racing back through every second of that afternoon, every surface she had wiped, every object she had carefully avoided touching, every rule she had followed, because she knew how easily things could turn against her, how quickly a single moment could define everything. "We should check her," the house manager added, his tone now more decisive, more certain, as if the conclusion had already been reached, and this was just a formality, just to be sure. The words hit harder than the accusation itself. And for a brief moment, Naomi felt something break inside her, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thread snapping under too much tension, because this wasn't just about a watch anymore, it was about dignity, about being reduced to suspicion, about standing in a room full of people who had already decided who she was without ever asking, She opened her mouth to speak again, to defend herself, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. They stayed trapped somewhere between her chest and her throat, heavy and unformed. And then, without warning, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was immediate, like a change in pressure before a storm. The murmurs stopped, the subtle movements stilled, and one by one, the guests turned their attention toward the doorway. Vincent DeLuca had entered the room. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply walked in with the same controlled presence that defined everything about him. His dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving slowly across the scene in front of him, taking in every detail without reacting to any of it. Naomi felt her breath catch as his gaze passed over her, not lingering, not dismissing, just observing, and for a reason she couldn't explain. That brief moment of eye contact felt heavier than all the accusations combined. He said nothing at first, and in that silence, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict that hadn't yet been spoken. Because while everyone else had already decided what they believed, Vincent DeLuca was still looking, and what he was looking at wasn't the missing watch. Vincent DeLuca did not look at the house manager first, nor at Isabella, nor even at the empty display case where the watch had been kept. Instead, his attention moved slowly, deliberately, across the room as if he were studying something far more complex than a missing object. His eyes tracing the positions of the guests, the distance between them, the subtle shifts in posture that most people would never notice. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and almost quiet, yet it carried enough weight to silence even the faintest whisper. Explain. The house manager stepped forward immediately, eager to fill the silence, his confidence returning now that the authority of the room had arrived. Sir, the watch was secured in your study earlier this afternoon. Miss Carter was assigned to clean the room at approximately 3:45, and when I conducted a routine check at 5:05, the watch was no longer there. He gestured slightly toward Naomi without fully turning to face her, as if even acknowledging her directly was unnecessary. She was the only one who entered the room during that window. Vincent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his gaze shifted briefly toward Naomi again, not with accusation, not with sympathy, but with a kind of quiet focus that made her feel as though he was measuring something deeper than her words could ever express, her breathing uneven, her chest tight, as she forced herself to remain still under the weight of the room's attention. Isabella took a small step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble, the sound sharp in the stillness. "It is unfortunate," she said, her tone smooth and controlled. "But we cannot ignore the obvious. These things do not simply disappear." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to suggest certainty without needing to raise her voice. And it would not be the first time someone underestimated the value of what they were handling. Naomi felt the words settle over her like a verdict already decided, her throat tightening as she tried to speak again. "I followed every instruction," she managed, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "I did not touch the watch. I did not move anything on the desk except the papers that were already out of place." But even as she spoke, she could see it in their faces, the disbelief, the quiet dismissal, the assumption that her explanation was nothing more than an attempt to avoid consequences she could not escape. Vincent's gaze shifted again, this time toward the desk across the room, the heavy mahogany surface still perfectly arranged, except for one detail that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. He walked toward it slowly, his footsteps soft but deliberate, each one echoing just enough to draw attention without demanding it. And as he reached the edge of the desk, he paused, his fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood, Not searching, not hurried, simply present. You said it was here. He stated, not a question. His voice directed at no one in particular, and yet at everyone at once. Yes, sir. The house manager replied quickly, stepping closer, centered on the display stand, exactly where it has always been kept. Vincent nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then his eyes moved to the surface beside the stand, to a faint circular mark that caught the light at just the right angle, the kind of mark left behind when something had rested there for longer than it should have, the kind of detail most people would never notice unless they were looking for it, and yet he had seen it the moment he entered the room. Always, Vincent repeated softly, his tone unreadable, and for the first time, something in the room shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to name it, but enough to create a pause that stretched just a little too long. Naomi watched him, her confusion mixing with a fragile thread of something she had not felt since the accusation began. Not hope exactly, but the absence of immediate judgment. The sense that for the first time since she had been called into the center of the room, someone was not simply accepting the easiest answer. Vincent turned slightly, his gaze moving back to the group, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Isabella, who held his look without flinching, her posture still flawless, her expression unchanged. But there was a tension there now, subtle, almost invisible, the kind that only someone paying very close attention would notice. "Who else entered the study?" Vincent asked, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a sharper edge beneath the surface. The house manager hesitated, just for a moment, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. "No one, sir," he answered. Though his tone lacked the certainty it had carried before, the access schedule is strictly maintained. Vincent did not respond immediately, and in that silence, the weight of his question seemed to settle deeper into the room, pressing against the edges of every assumption that had been made, every conclusion that had been drawn too quickly. Naomi stood where she was, her hands still clenched, her pulse still racing, but something inside her had shifted as well, because for the first time since this began, the story being told no longer felt complete, and Vincent DeLuca was not looking at her like the answer. He was looking at everything else like the question. The hesitation lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, subtle but unmistakable, and Vincent did not move to fill it. He allowed it to stretch, to settle into the silence like a weight pressing against the room, forcing everyone present to feel it, to sit inside it. And it was in that silence that the certainty from moments before began to crack, just slightly, just enough to be noticed by those who were paying attention. The house manager cleared his throat, shifting his stance as though adjusting his footing on uncertain ground. "The schedule is precise, sir," he repeated, though now his words carried a trace of defensiveness that had not been there before. "Staff assignments are logged, and access to your study is restricted. Miss Carter signed in at 3:45 and signed out at 4:10. No one else was recorded." Vincent's gaze did not return to Naomi. Instead, it remained on the desk, on that faint circular impression in the polished wood. His mind tracing something unseen, something that did not align with what he was being told, because he knew that mark. He had noticed it days before, when the watch had not been placed back in its usual position after his last meeting. A detail so small it would have meant nothing to anyone else, but to him it meant that something had already been out of place long before Naomi had ever stepped into that room. Isabella's voice broke through the silence again, softer this time, but sharper in its intent. "If there is confusion about the timeline, we can clarify it later," she said, her tone carrying a subtle urgency now. "But right now, we are dealing with a missing item that belongs to you. Vincent, And the longer we delay, the more complicated it becomes. Vincent turned his head slightly toward her, just enough to acknowledge her presence, his expression still unreadable. But there was a shift there, something colder, something more precise, like a blade being aligned before it ever needed to be used. Complicated, he repeated, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as though testing the word rather than accepting it. Naomi stood where she was, her pulse still racing. But now her attention was fixed entirely on Vincent, because something had changed, something she could not fully understand but could feel, like the moment before a storm when the air becomes still and heavy, and she realized that he was not asking questions to confirm what had already been decided. He was asking questions because he had not decided anything at all. Vincent stepped away from the desk, his movements slow, deliberate, his presence drawing the focus of every person in the room without effort. And as he walked, his gaze moved from face to face, not lingering long enough to accuse, but long enough to observe, to register reactions that others might overlook, the slight tightening of a jaw, the shift of a glance, the barely noticeable change in posture when attention passed too close. "Show me the logs," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable finality that made it clear this was not a request. The house manager hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, before nodding quickly, pulling a tablet from his side and stepping forward, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency as he brought up the access records. "Here, sir," he said, holding it out. Vincent did not take it immediately. Instead, he let the moment stretch again, his eyes still on the man holding the device, and then he accepted it, his gaze dropping briefly to the screen as he reviewed the entries, his expression unchanged, but his mind moving quickly, connecting details that had not yet been spoken aloud. Naomi watched as he scrolled, her breath catching as she realized that this was the first time anyone had looked at anything other than her. The first time the focus had shifted away from her presence and toward the actual facts of what had happened. And with that shift came a fragile, unfamiliar feeling. Not relief, not yet, but the possibility that the truth might matter more than assumption. Vincent's thumb paused on the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly as he examined a specific entry, and then he looked up, his gaze moving once more across the room. Slower this time, more deliberate, as though confirming something he had already begun to suspect. "At 4:23, he said quietly, his voice cutting cleanly through the silence. "There is an access override." The house manager blinked, his expression tightening. "That is not possible, sir. The system does not allow unauthorized—" "It is there," Vincent interrupted, not raising his voice, but ending the objection before it could fully form, his tone carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. The room stilled again. But this time the silence felt different, heavier, more focused, as though the foundation of the earlier accusation had shifted just enough to make everyone aware that it might not hold. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as she processed the words. An access override, something that did not fit the simple story that had been built around her, something that suggested there had been more to that afternoon than anyone had been willing to consider. Vincent handed the tablet back without comment, his gaze lifting once more, and when his eyes passed over Naomi again, there was still no judgment there, no accusation, only that same quiet focus, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a suspect, not as a conclusion, but as part of a much larger question that had not yet been answered. The words settled over the room like a quiet fracture spreading beneath polished glass, an access override, something that should not have existed and yet now sat undeniable in the center of everything, and for the first time since the accusation had begun, the certainty that had once filled the space began to dissolve into something far less stable. The house manager shifted again, more noticeably now, his composure tightening as he reached for the tablet Vincent had returned, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as if searching for an explanation that would restore control to a situation that was slipping away from him. "It must be a system error," he said, his voice carefully measured but no longer steady. "These logs can occasionally display irregularities when number Vincent said quietly, and the single word cut through the explanation before it could take shape, not loud, not forceful, but final, leaving no space for reinterpretation." The manager's mouth closed, the unfinished excuse dissolving in the air as Vincent stepped forward again, his presence drawing the room inward without effort, his gaze no longer drifting, but focused now, precise, as though he had crossed from observation into conclusion. Naomi felt the shift immediately, her breath catching as she realized that the narrative that had been built around her was no longer holding together, and yet the weight of the room had not lifted. It had simply moved, redirecting itself towards something else, something not yet fully revealed. Isabella's posture remained composed, but there was a subtle change now, a stillness that was too deliberate, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass before relaxing again, her expression smooth, controlled, but her eyes watching Vincent more closely than before, as if recalculating something that had been assumed to be certain. "If there was an override," she said, her tone softer now, more careful. "Then perhaps someone in security made an adjustment. These systems are not always as rigid as we believe." Vincent turned his head toward her fully this time, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. But there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something that suggested he was no longer considering possibilities, he was narrowing them. "Security reports directly to me," he said, his voice calm, "and no adjustments were authorized today." The room fell silent again, but this silence carried a different weight, one that pressed more heavily against those who had spoken with certainty before, because now certainty had become something dangerous. Naomi stood motionless, her mind racing, trying to understand how something she had not even known existed could now be the thing that shifted everything. Her earlier fear still present, but no longer suffocating, replaced by a fragile awareness that the truth was not as simple as they had made it seem. Vincent stepped past the manager, his attention returning briefly to the desk, his eyes tracing the surface once more, then lifting toward the doorway that led to the study, as if replaying something in his mind, something that had not aligned from the beginning. "At 4:23, he said again, slower this time, as though each second mattered. The system registered access, but there was no entry logged before or after. He paused, just long enough for the implication to settle, for the absence of information to become more important than what had been recorded. That means whoever entered did not use standard authorization. The manager's grip tightened on the tablet, his knuckles paling slightly. That would require a master override, he admitted reluctantly, the words coming slower now, a code that only a few individuals possess. Vincent's gaze did not leave him. List them. The request was simple, but it carried a weight that shifted the focus of the entire room, pulling attention away from Naomi completely and toward a new center of gravity that no one had prepared for. The manager hesitated again, longer this time, and that hesitation spoke louder than anything he could have said. "You, sir," he began, his voice quieter now. "Myself, and..." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward Isabella before returning to Vincent. "And Miss Moretti." The silence that followed was absolute, not a single movement, not a single whisper, as though the room itself had stopped breathing. Naomi felt it too. The sudden shift, the way every assumption that had been placed on her now seemed to hang uncertain in the air, no longer anchored by the confidence that had once supported it. Vincent did not react immediately, and in that stillness, his lack of reaction became its own form of response, more powerful than any outburst could have been. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, from the manager to Isabella, and for the first time since the evening began. The attention that had once been directed at Naomi settled fully on someone else. Isabella met his eyes without flinching, her posture still perfect, her expression calm. But there was something different now, something that had not been there before, a tension that lingered just beneath the surface, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise flawless composition. "Then we narrow it down," Vincent said quietly, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a quiet finality that left no room for misinterpretation, because mistakes do not create overrides. And in that moment, the accusation that had once felt absolute began to unravel, thread by thread, leaving behind a truth that had not yet been spoken, but was now impossible to ignore. The silence that followed Vincent's words did not break. It deepened, pressing into the room with a quiet force that made even the smallest movement feel significant. And for the first time since the accusation began, Naomi was no longer at the center of it. She could feel the shift as clearly as if the ground beneath her feet had tilted, redirecting the weight of every gaze, every thought, every unspoken conclusion toward a different direction, one that no longer pointed at her. Vincent did not rush. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary questions. Instead, he allowed it to do its work, to reveal what pressure always revealed when applied correctly. And as he stood there, his posture relaxed, but his presence unmistakable. It became clear that he was no longer trying to understand what had happened. He was waiting to see who would reveal it. The house manager adjusted his grip on the tablet again, his earlier confidence now replaced with something more cautious, more measured, as if every word he spoke had to be chosen carefully. "There must be an explanation," he said, though the certainty had drained from his voice, leaving behind something that sounded more like hope than fact. "The override code is secure. It is not something that can be used without authorization." Vincent's gaze shifted back to him briefly, not dismissing, not agreeing, simply observing, and that observation alone was enough to make the man's words feel incomplete. Isabella set her glass down on the side table with a soft, controlled motion, the faint sound echoing just enough to draw attention without demanding it, her posture still flawless, her expression composed. But there was a subtle tension now in the way she held herself, a stillness that felt less natural, more deliberate, as if she were maintaining control rather than simply possessing it. "If we are questioning access," she said, her tone even, measured, "then we should also consider intent. Because access alone does not explain why something would be taken." Her eyes moved briefly, almost imperceptibly toward Naomi before returning to Vincent, the gesture so small it could have been missed, but in a room where every detail had begun to matter, nothing went unnoticed. Naomi felt that glance like a shadow passing over her, the accusation not fully gone, just quieter, more careful, as if it were waiting for the right moment to return. Vincent did not respond immediately, and in that pause, the room seemed to hold itself still, waiting for direction, waiting for resolution. But Vincent was not offering either, not yet. Instead, he stepped closer to the center of the room, his gaze moving again, slower now, more deliberate, as though each person present had become part of a pattern he was studying, something that only revealed itself when seen as a whole. "At 3:45, he said quietly, his voice steady. Miss Carter entered the study to clean. Naomi's breath caught as she realized he was recounting the timeline, not to accuse, but to reconstruct, to place each piece exactly where it belonged. At 4:10, she left, he continued, his eyes briefly meeting hers, not questioning, not doubting, simply acknowledging. And in that brief moment, Naomi felt something shift inside her, something steadying, something that allowed her to stand a little straighter despite everything that had happened. At 4:23, Vincent went on. An override was used to access the same room. He let the words settle, let the gap between them become visible, undeniable. 13 minutes. The number lingered in the air, simple, precise, but heavy with implication, because 13 minutes was enough time for many things, but it was not enough time to remain invisible if someone had been paying attention. Vincent's gaze lifted again, moving across the room, stopping briefly on the manager, then shifting to Isabella, and in that moment, the weight of his attention was unmistakable, not accusatory, not yet, but focused, intentional. Who was still in the house at that time? He asked, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that made the question feel less like an inquiry and more like a narrowing of possibilities. The manager swallowed, his earlier certainty now replaced with careful calculation. All guests were arriving for dinner preparations, he said. Staff were transitioning between assignments, and Miss Moretti was... He paused, just for a fraction of a second. In the West Wing, Isabella's expression did not change, but her stillness deepened, her composure now something she was actively maintaining, rather than something that came naturally. And for the first time, the balance of the room felt unstable, as though the roles that had been assigned at the beginning of the evening were no longer holding. Naomi stood quietly, her hands no longer trembling, her breathing steadier, as she realized that the story that had been built around her was no longer the only story in the room. And that realization did not bring relief, not yet, but it brought something just as important, the possibility that she would be seen not as a conclusion, but as a part of the truth. Vincent let the silence return once more, but this time it was different. It was not empty, it was full, filled with everything that had not yet been said, everything that was beginning to surface. And as he stood there, his presence anchoring the room, it became clear that whatever had happened in those 13 minutes was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting to be revealed. The number still hung in the air. 13 minutes. Simple, measurable, undeniable. And yet no one in the room seemed willing to step into that space it created, because stepping into it meant becoming part of it. And Vincent did not rush to fill it for them. He let the silence press in, let it settle against every thought, every calculation, until even the most composed among them could feel its weight. Then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he spoke again. Lock the doors. The command was quiet, almost casual, but it moved through the room with immediate effect. 2 members of the security team, stationed near the entrance, straightened and nodded, moving without hesitation. And within seconds, the soft click of reinforced locks echoed through the space, subtle but final, transforming the room from a gathering into something else entirely, something contained. A ripple of unease moved through the guests, not loud, not chaotic, but present, a shifting of posture, a tightening of expressions, the realization settling in that no one would be leaving until this was resolved. Naomi felt it too, the shift from accusation to investigation, the change in atmosphere from judgment to something far more precise. And though her heart still raced, there was a strange steadiness growing beneath it, because for the first time since this began, the focus was no longer on removing her. It was on uncovering something else. Isabella's gaze flickered briefly toward the doors before returning to Vincent, her expression still controlled, but the composure now felt more deliberate, more maintained, as if it required effort rather than existing naturally. "Is that really necessary?" she asked, her tone light but edged with something sharper beneath. "This is a private gathering, not an interrogation." Vincent turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers with calm certainty. It became necessary the moment something was hidden. He replied, his voice even, unhurried, but carrying a quiet authority that did not invite further argument. The room stilled again, the subtle tension deepening into something more focused, more contained, as if every person present had been drawn into a space where truth mattered more than comfort. Vincent took a slow step forward, his gaze moving once more across the room, but this time it did not drift. It landed, briefly, precisely, noting reactions as they formed, as they tried to hide, as they adjusted, because now he was not observing, he was narrowing. "We will review the cameras," he said, his tone unchanged, from 3:30 to 5. The house manager hesitated, his grip on the tablet tightening again. "Sir, the internal system only retains partial footage in real time, and there was a brief outage earlier. It may not bring what is available," Vincent interrupted, not raising his voice, but ending the explanation before it could create doubt, and the manager nodded quickly. Turning away to signal one of the staff members, his earlier confidence replaced now with urgency. Naomi watched as the room shifted around her, her earlier isolation replaced by something else entirely. A quiet distance, as if she had been moved out of the center without anyone needing to say it out loud. And in that space, she found herself able to breathe a little more steadily, her hands loosening slightly at her sides, though her eyes never left Vincent, because everything that was happening now seemed to move through him, shaped by his decisions, guided by his attention. Isabella moved closer to the center of the room, her posture still composed, her expression calm, but there was a subtle change in the way she held herself, a stillness that felt too controlled, too exact, as if she were holding something in place rather than simply standing there. "Even if there was an override," she said, her tone softer now, more measured, "it does not prove anything on its own. It could have been a system malfunction, or someone testing access protocols." Vincent's gaze shifted to her again, steady, unblinking. "Then the footage will clarify that," he replied simply, and the simplicity of the answer left no room for deflection. Moments later, a staff member approached with a secondary tablet, handing it carefully to the manager, who passed it to Vincent without speaking, his hands now noticeably less steady than before. Vincent accepted it, his attention dropping briefly to the screen as he navigated through the recorded segments, the room falling into complete silence as everyone watched, not daring to interrupt, not daring to assume what he would find. Naomi's breath slowed as she watched him, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. But for the first time, those questions were not directed at herself. They were directed at the space between events, at the missing pieces that were beginning to take shape. Vincent paused the footage, his thumb resting against the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied a specific moment, and then he looked up, his gaze moving once more across the room, slower now, more deliberate, as though confirming something that had already begun to form in his mind. "Interesting," he said quietly, the single word carrying more weight than any explanation, because it was not the kind of word used when something confirmed expectations. It was the kind of word used when something did not. The room remained still, every person waiting, every breath held. As Vincent lowered the tablet slightly, his eyes lifting again. And in that moment, it became clear that whatever he had just seen had not closed the question. It had opened it wider, and someone in that room was about to feel the full weight of it. Vincent did not explain what he saw right away, and that silence was intentional. It stretched just long enough to make every person in the room aware that something had shifted again, something subtle but undeniable, and this time it did not feel like uncertainty. It felt like direction. He raised the tablet slightly, not to show it yet, but as if to anchor the moment, his eyes lifting slowly, scanning the room one more time, not searching anymore, but confirming. Naomi felt it before anyone spoke. The quiet certainty in the air, the way the tension had changed from scattered unease into something far more focused, like a beam narrowing toward a single point. At 4:23, Vincent said, his voice calm, steady. The system shows an override, but the footage does not show someone entering through the main door. He paused, letting that settle, letting the contradiction breathe, because it mattered. It was the kind of detail that did not fit a simple story. The house manager frowned slightly, leaning forward as if trying to see the screen from a distance. "That is not possible. Sir, the study has only one entry point accessible to staff." Vincent did not look at him. His attention remained on the room. "That is what I was told," he replied quietly, and the way he said it made the statement feel less like agreement and more like a challenge. Isabella shifted her weight subtly, the movement almost imperceptible, but it was there, a small adjustment that did not align with the perfect stillness she had maintained earlier, and Vincent noticed, not openly, not with accusation, but with the same quiet precision that had guided everything he had done since he entered. Naomi watched him, her pulse steadying, her mind catching up with what he was saying. If no one had entered through the main door, then the story they had built around her could not be true, not in the way they had claimed, not in the way that had placed her at the center of it all. Vincent lowered the tablet slightly and turned, walking toward the far side of the room, toward the hallway that led to the study, his movements slow, deliberate, and without asking, without announcing. He stepped into the space beyond, knowing the others would follow, because at this point, no one was willing to remain behind. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving as well, drawn forward by something she could not fully name, but could not ignore, while the rest of the guests followed at a distance, their earlier confidence replaced now with quiet anticipation. The study door stood slightly ajar, just as it had been left after the earlier inspection, and Vincent paused at the threshold, his gaze moving across the room inside, taking in every detail, every surface, every object exactly as it was, not disturbed, not rearranged, just observed. "There," he said quietly, stepping inside and gesturing toward the far wall, not toward the desk, not toward the display stand, but toward a narrow panel that blended seamlessly into the design, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The house manager stepped closer, his expression tightening as he followed Vincent's gaze. "That is a service access panel," he said, his voice lower now, more cautious, "used for maintenance. It is not part of the regular staff routes." Vincent nodded slightly, his attention still fixed on it. "And yet it connects to the study." The implication settled immediately, heavy and clear, because it explained the footage, the absence of an entry through the main door, the presence of an override without visible movement. Naomi felt it fully now, the shift from doubt to clarity, the realization that whatever had happened, it had been done deliberately, carefully, in a way designed to avoid notice, to create exactly the kind of confusion that had led to her being blamed without question. Isabella remained near the doorway, her posture still composed, but the distance she kept now felt intentional, as though she were choosing her position carefully, maintaining space rather than simply occupying it. Vincent stepped closer to the panel, his fingers brushing lightly along the edge before pressing against it, and with a soft, controlled motion, it opened just enough to reveal the narrow passage beyond, dimly lit, easily overlooked, but undeniably connected. Convenient, he said quietly, not with admiration, but with recognition, because this was not an accident. It was a method. The room behind him remained silent. No one speaking, no one interrupting, because at this point, the truth was no longer something abstract. It was taking shape, becoming visible. And as Vincent turned back toward the group, his gaze moving slowly, deliberately, it became clear that he was no longer asking what had happened. He was about to show them who had made it happen. And in that moment, every assumption that had once pointed at Naomi was gone, replaced by a single, undeniable question that now hung over the entire room, waiting for its answer. The panel remained slightly open, just enough to reveal the narrow passage behind it. And in that small gap, everything that had once been uncertain now began to align with quiet precision. The missing time, the unexplained override, the absence of movement on the main footage, all of it no longer scattered pieces, but part of a single, deliberate design. Vincent did not rush forward into the passage. He did not need to. Instead, he stepped back, allowing the presence of it to speak for itself, allowing the room to absorb what it meant. And as he turned to face the others, his gaze moved slowly, deliberately, settling not on Naomi, not on the manager, but on Isabella. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable, like a spotlight moving without sound. And for the first time that evening, the balance of attention landed fully and completely on her. Isabella held his gaze, her posture still composed, her expression still controlled. But something had changed, not outwardly, not in a way that could be easily named, but in the space between stillness and effort, in the way her calm now felt maintained rather than natural. "You knew about the panel," Vincent said quietly, not a question, not an accusation raised in volume, but a statement placed with precision, as if it had already been verified long before he chose to speak it aloud. The room remained silent, every eye shifting toward Isabella, waiting, watching, measuring her response in a way they had once measured Naomi, and the reversal was as quiet as it was complete. Isabella did not answer immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, carried more weight than any immediate denial could have, because in a room where every second had begun to matter, hesitation had become its own kind of truth. "The house has many design features," she said finally, her voice even, her tone controlled. "I have been here often enough to be familiar with its layout." Vincent nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the statement while not accepting it fully, his eyes never leaving hers. Familiar enough to use an override. He continued, his voice unchanged, still calm, still steady, but now carrying a quiet certainty that had not been there before, because the pattern was no longer forming, it was complete. The house manager shifted beside them, his earlier authority gone entirely now, replaced by a visible unease as he looked between Vincent and Isabella, as if recalculating everything he thought he understood about the situation. Naomi stood near the doorway, her hands now relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, watching as the truth unfolded not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through something far more controlled, far more precise. And in that control, she felt something settle inside her, something that had been shaken loose when the accusation first fell on her. Isabella's eyes flickered briefly toward the open panel before returning to Vincent, and in that moment, the smallest crack appeared in her composure, Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. A shift that could not be undone once seen. "Even if I knew about it," she said. Her tone still measured. "That does not mean I used it." Vincent did not respond immediately. And in that silence, he reached out, not toward her, not toward the panel, but toward the desk behind him, his fingers brushing along the surface before lifting something small, something that had gone unnoticed until now. He held it up just enough for the light to catch it, a faint smudge, barely visible, a trace of oil left behind on the polished wood, not where the watch had been, but near the edge, closer to where someone might stand if they were approaching from the hidden passage rather than the main door. "Position matters," he said quietly, his gaze returning to her. "Because people move differently depending on where they enter a room." The implication settled heavily, because it was no longer about access. It was about behavior, about patterns that could not be easily explained away. Isabella's composure tightened, her stillness becoming more rigid, more deliberate, as if holding it together now required effort. And in that effort, the truth became clearer to everyone watching. Vincent took a single step closer, not aggressive, not forceful, but enough to close the distance between them, enough to make the space feel smaller, more focused. "You created the gap," he said, his voice low, steady. 13 minutes. Enough time to enter unseen, remove the watch, and leave through the same path, knowing the system would record the override, but not the entry. He paused, just long enough for the full weight of it to settle, for every person in the room to understand not just what had happened, but how carefully it had been arranged. "And you needed someone else in the room before that," he continued, his gaze flicking briefly toward Naomi, then back to Isabella. "Someone who would be seen, someone who would be remembered, someone who could be blamed without question." The silence that followed was absolute. No whispers, no movement, just the quiet recognition of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. And as Isabella stood there, her composure no longer effortless, her stillness no longer natural, it became clear that the story that had once seemed so simple had never been simple at all. It had been constructed, piece by piece, designed to lead exactly where it had led, until Vincent chose to look where no one else had thought to look, and in doing so, revealed everything. The truth did not explode. It settled, heavy and undeniable, filling the room with a silence so complete that even the faint hum of the air system seemed distant, irrelevant, as if the world beyond those walls had paused to witness what had just been revealed. Isabella did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She did not attempt to deny it again. And that absence of reaction spoke louder than any defense she could have offered, because in a room where every word had been measured, every movement observed, silence had become its own confession. Vincent did not move immediately either. He did not press further. He did not demand an admission because he did not need one. The pattern was complete. The explanation already laid out with a precision that left no room for doubt. He simply turned slightly, his gaze shifting away from her, not dismissing, but concluding, as though the matter had already been decided the moment the pieces aligned. "Retrieve it," he said quietly. His voice directed not at Isabella, but at the security team, and within seconds, 2 men moved toward the open panel, stepping into the narrow passage with controlled efficiency, their presence disappearing into the dim space beyond. No one spoke while they were gone. No one moved. The room held in a suspended stillness that seemed to stretch far longer than the few moments that passed, because now everyone understood that what had been taken was not lost. It had simply been hidden, and it was about to be brought back into the light. Naomi stood where she was, her hands now completely still, her breathing even, her eyes fixed on Vincent, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but with a quiet awareness that everything had changed, not just for her, but for everyone in that room, because the assumptions that had once defined her had been exposed for what they were: fragile, convenient, and wrong. The security team returned quickly, one of them stepping forward and placing the watch carefully into Vincent's hand, the polished metal catching the light exactly as it had before, untouched, undamaged, but no longer surrounded by mystery. Vincent looked at it for a brief moment, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with recognition, as though confirming that the final piece had returned to its place. And then he closed his hand around it and turned back to the room. His gaze moved once more, slowly, deliberately, passing over each face, lingering just long enough to make it clear that he had seen everything, not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to happen, how quickly judgment had been assigned, how easily dignity had been discarded in favor of assumption. When his eyes reached Naomi, they paused, and for the first time since the evening began, there was something different there, not softness, not sympathy, but acknowledgement, clear and unmistakable. "You will continue your work here," he said, his voice steady, calm, but carrying a weight that made the statement feel larger than the words themselves, because it was not just about employment. It was about restoration, about correcting something that had been taken from her without cause. Naomi felt the words settle into her, not as relief, not as victory, but as something quieter, something steadier, the return of something she had nearly lost, the simple recognition that she had been seen, not as a suspect, not as a mistake, but as a person whose dignity had not been erased by someone else's narrative. Vincent turned his attention back to Isabella then, and the room seemed to tighten once more, not with tension, but with expectation, because this moment carried its own weight, its own conclusion. He did not raise his voice, he did not step closer, he did not need to. His presence alone was enough to hold the space. "This house does not protect lies," he said quietly, each word deliberate, measured, final. "And it does not sacrifice truth for convenience." He paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle, for every person in the room to understand that what had happened was not just about a watch, it was about something deeper, something that defined the space they stood in. "You will leave," he added, his tone unchanged, but carrying an authority that required no repetition, no enforcement beyond the certainty of his voice. Isabella did not argue. She did not respond. She simply turned, her composure still intact on the surface, but now hollow beneath it, and walked toward the exit, the quiet sound of her heels against the marble marking each step as she crossed the room that no longer belonged to her. No one spoke as she left, no one moved to stop her, because there was nothing left to say, nothing left to question. The doors unlocked with a soft click, and as they opened, the outside world returned, but the room itself remained changed, the air still carrying the weight of what had been revealed. Vincent stood for a moment longer, then turned away. The matter closed not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. And in that silence, in that stillness, something far more lasting remained, the understanding that in a world built on power, it was not the loudest voice that defined truth, but the one willing to see it. And that day, the room had remembered exactly what dignity looks like.